Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be joining us today in this virtual world. My name is Greg Mencken. I'm the Executive Director of the Adam Smith Society. Thank you so much for joining us today for the latest here in our Eventcast series. Online or in person, the mission of the Adam Smith Society to promote discussion around the benefits of capitalism will continue. If you'd like to learn more about the organization, please visit us online at adamsmithsociety.com. Joining us today for a discussion about what common rhetoric gets wrong about higher education lending is economist Beth Akers. She'll give us about a 15 to 20-minute briefing followed by audience Q&A. Please submit your questions through your control panel on the right of your screen. Please state your name, and if you're a member of the Adam Smith Society, please give us your chapter affiliation as well. At this point, I'd like to welcome Beth to the screen.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks so much for joining us, Beth. If you don't mind, I'll just give folks a little bit of background. Beth is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where her work focuses on labor economics and the economics of higher education. Previously, she was a fellow at the Brookings Institution and a staff economist with the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. Beth is the co-author of the book Game of Loans, The Rhetoric and Reality of Student Debt. Her writing and research has appeared across all major news organizations, print, online, broadcast, you name it. She received her PhD from Columbia University. Beth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
So let me kick things off by asking the question. We read a lot in the news on a fairly regular basis about a lot of young people with very large sums of student debt. Does your book really argue that there's no student loan crisis, and how could that be true?
Yeah, so it sort of does. It sort of does and it doesn't. But I'll tell you what, there was a long period of time where that was the way that people interpreted my writing. And I kind of became the student loan crisis denier, which is not a way to be very popular, at least not in Washington, D.C., with all the young professionals with the massive amounts of debt that they actually do have. But yeah, I think it's helpful for me to start and talk about where this research came from and the motivation for this research to kind of help you see where I get to where I do get to with the book. So when I finished, I took a break out of graduate school to work under the Bush administration and had the opportunity to work very briefly on federal student loan policy, and went back to graduate school and wrote my dissertation on higher education finance. And, you know, there's kind of a very clear message from the economics literature, at least at that time, about student debt and the return on investment in higher education. And that's that it's worth it, that, you know, we can estimate that there are these huge returns to investing in higher education. And that's why people actually, it makes sense for them to go out and borrow to make that investment. So then, you know, come to my first job after graduate school, I'm sitting at Brookings, where one of my responsibilities is to talk to the media. So I, coming out of academia, had somewhat of a narrow understanding of the public policy issues of the day, but had to quickly come up to speed with them. And one of the things that I found that reporters continued to ask me over and over at the end of those informational interview calls was, is there a student loan crisis on the horizon? And I really struggled with answering that question because at the time, like I said, my understanding came from the academic sense and the literature that estimated these huge return on investment. And so from that perspective, people were borrowing, but they were getting huge returns and more than compensating for the amount that it cost them to borrow. And so there was a dissonance between the way that I understood the issue of student lending and the way that it was being portrayed in the media. So in order to really be able to provide some evidence, I spent the next few years covering the issue of student loan finance with my research to understand where that dissonance was coming from. And, you know, as an economist, I think we sometimes are too quick to be dismissive of people's feelings, and that people certainly feel upset about student loans. There's something to that, you know, so I don't want to dismiss that there's a crisis entirely. But what I did want to do is add some facts to the story so that we can start to understand exactly what that crisis is, if it's not that people are having a difficult time in getting that financial return. So I think it's helpful if I run through a few of those facts that were sort of illuminated by that early research that I did on the issue. So the first thing that I found, and I did a lot of this work with my co-author Matt Chingos at the time, is that those balances that we hear an awful lot about in the media, in New York Times, Washington Post, what have you, those very high balances are actually exceedingly rare. So the average balance that someone leaves an undergraduate program of study with is about $30,000. So that's a reasonable sum of money, considering that this is an investment that pays off over the course of a lifetime and can be paid back over the course of 20 years. Also, we found that only 2% of borrowers actually have balances that are in excess of $100,000. So you might have seen the story, I wish I could remember, but it's either New York Times or Washington Post, where they profiled a dentist who had somehow amassed $1 million in student loan debt. And I think those sorts of stories make people tend to think that that's a norm, but in fact, it's not. So 2% of people had more than $100,000 in student debt outstanding, and just 7 had more than $50,000 outstanding. So for me, that seemed like a point of fact that was really dissonant with at least the impression that I was receiving from media coverage of the issue. The second thing was that we found that those high balances, when they existed, actually weren't so bad. And many of you being in graduate and professional school, may fit into this category of having this experience. What we saw when we looked at default rates and the trouble that people had repaying their loans was that people who had very high balances were actually doing really well. So they very seldom default on their loans. This makes a lot of sense if you think about the fundamentals. Higher education pays huge dividends in terms of earnings opportunities and more consistent employment. So getting a lot of debt probably comes with having a lot of education at the same time. So what we see is that a lot of those very high balance borrowers are people who have graduate and professional degrees that give them access to high earnings that makes the repayment of their loans actually affordable. So sort of an obvious thing if you think about it, but again, kind of dissonant with what we've been told to believe. More to that point, if you look at who is actually struggling to repay their loans, what we see is that the highest rate of default is actually among borrowers who have less than $5,000 in debt. And so these are borrowers who very often started their degree but did not finish. So for these individuals, a very small amount of debt is actually a huge problem. And so, I don't want to be entirely dismissive of there being a student loan crisis, but there is no national student loan crisis of the nature that I think people have imagined for a really long time. But there is a crisis for those people. This is a small subset of people who try college. It doesn't work for them for whatever reason. They've sunk money into that investment, but they haven't seen the return because they haven't gotten access to higher earnings. And therefore, that even that small sum that they borrowed becomes problematic. So this is where we start to drill down to what are the actual challenges. At the time that I started doing this work, we were just a few years out from the financial crisis that was started by irresponsible lending in mortgage markets. And so I think when people were asking if there was a student loan crisis, and I think this still has a bit of truth in the question when people are asking it today, they seem to be asking if there is a macroeconomic crisis, something that's systemically going to affect our economy, driven by irresponsible lending in higher education. I understand the parallel, I understand the potential concern, but the fundamentals in this market are completely different. One is that these investments, for the most part, are sound. Two, they make up a relatively small share of our overall economy. So for the potential for them to disturb our macro economy is very limited. And last, they're actually not so much a market at all as they are a federal program. So in the worst case, these are debts that don't get repaid to the federal government, which is problematic from a fiscal sense, but is not putting us in the potential for the sort of systemic crisis and fallout that came from something like the mortgage market. So again, kind of knowing this before, from my academic appreciation of the issue of higher ed finance, those initial years when I was working on this issue also revealed more statistics supporting this notion that higher education is in fact worth it, despite people having to borrow in order to get there. So some of the numbers, just to give you a sense here, some of the best estimates, and these are coming from a variety of institutions, estimate that the return over the course of your lifetime for a bachelor's degree is about $1 million. So that means people with bachelor's degrees are earning an extra $1 million over the course of their career relative to a similar person who only had a high school diploma. That, as you can imagine, is a difficult parameter to estimate. And so it's helpful to know that that's been, that exercise has been done in a number of ways, and similar estimates are found. Not exactly similar in terms of them being the same number, but similar in that the returns are very large and very positive. In another study from the New York Fed, again, not a political institution, they find that the average rate of return, if we were to calculate it as if it were a stock or a bond, is 15%. So if you're familiar with stock market, maybe not in very recent moments, but historically we look at about a 7% return on average for the indices. So a 15% rate of return is actually a really generous return on that investment. And that's even taking into account that people have to pay interest on loans in order to make the investment. So the last thing that I came to understand, in investigating this issue of whether or not there was a crisis on the horizon, is that in fact we already have very generous safety nets in place to help borrowers for whom the debt actually does become really unaffordable. And this is something that's really surprising to a lot of people, maybe to those of you in the audience who have some debt of your own, who might be concerned about it. We talk a lot in the political discourse today about different programs that are going to forgive student debt for, like sweeping a number of people in the economy. But we already have a program in place that's very generous in giving directed forgiveness to people who have debts that over time have proven to be unaffordable. So these are the set of income-based repayment plans. What they do is, instead of just having the borrower pay a monthly payment on their loan, like it was a car loan or a mortgage, what it does is it sets the amount that's due back to the Department of Education each month, or the servicer, according to how much that person is earning. And so if they're not earning very much, or they're not working at all, then they owe nothing that month. And that postpones the repayment without penalty, other than continuing accrued interest over the period of time. But it provides a safety net. So if there's a moment in time when you're not earning very much or not earning anything at all, you're not on the hook to make payments that you can't afford. And so people might say, oh, that's nice, but it's just kicking the can down the road. But what happens is that in these programs, if you do kick the can down the road and you keep kicking the can down the road because that debt is really just truly unaffordable for that borrower in the long run, the debt becomes forgiven. And so for everyone, they're eligible to have debt forgiven through this manner after 20 years for any balances that remain. And people who work in nonprofit or public sectors can actually have any outstanding debt balances forgiven after 10 years. And so the awareness of that program is shockingly low. I think a lot of students don't know about that safety net when they take on the debt in the first place. And it seems from the evidence from other researchers, and not myself, that there's a real problem of people being aware of that, and that may be contributing to people's angst and concern about whether or not the debt that we have is affordable. So, to answer the question, is there a student loan crisis on the horizon? In some ways, yes. There are little crises all over our higher education finance system. For example, the people who start college who don't finish and take on debt in order to do so, and then end up having a struggle to pay back those loans. That's a big problem. But there's also, to characterize a couple other problems, the thing that I'm particularly concerned about is the information deficit that seems to exist in the higher ed finance space. So just like I said, people seem largely unaware of the existence of these safety nets. What we see is that there's a deficit of information that people are using to make economically minded decisions when they decide if and where to go to college and how much to pay. So to some extent, that problem has been solved in recent years, and that the federal government is starting to publish information on earnings for every college in the country that participates in the federal aid program. But it also seems that the culture of college going in this country has not really adopted the use of those sorts of tools for people to shop. The second is coming from some original research that I did working with some university partners. What I found was that through surveying students, I identified that most students could not actually tell me how much they were paying for college, and nor could they tell me how much they had borrowed. And the survey was taken immediately after they signed their promissory note in the first semester of college enrollment. So this is incredibly problematic and might give a sense of, in fact, where some of this anger and sense of victimization is coming from, that, these may be investments that pay off over the long run, but if it's a trade-off that you didn't realize you were making at the time, it's certainly understandable that you might be a bit unhappy when that first student loan bill comes due and have some concern about your ability to repay. So I'll kind of stop there on the question of student loan crisis and just give a few comments on current policy. So what we're seeing, particularly in the Democratic run up to the Democratic nomination, was a discussion about widespread forgiveness of student loans. And so given what we discussed in terms of who's actually struggling with these student debts, you might not be surprised to learn that the widespread forgiveness plans that came from people like Sanders and Warren are actually largely regressive, in that forgiving outstanding student debt delivers the biggest benefits to the people who often need them the least. Those include people who have borrowed large sums. They have a lot to be forgiven, so they have a lot to benefit by forgiveness. But these are probably also people who statistically tend to be the highest earners in our economy. And so my previous workplace, Brookings Institution, put out a great report where they actually tried to measure where do the benefits of widespread student loan forgiveness actually go. And what they found or were able to confirm was that the benefits are actually concentrated among the more well-off, high-earning people in the economy. And the bottom 60% of the income distribution only get about a third of the benefit of the spending that goes into that program. So, to sum up that point, I guess I'd say I'm largely not supportive of a sweeping student loan forgiveness program. I'd much prefer to see that we take the safety nets that we have in place today and make them work better, because there's a problem with awareness of people, not knowing how to make use of those, not knowing that they exist. But then even if once you've made connection with that program, the reality is that those were built sort of piecemeal through legislation and regulation over time, and there was no sweeping program so that everybody has universal access to a simple, easy to use benefit. And that's something that does need to be fixed. So I'll go ahead and stop there. And I think it would be good to move on to the Q&A portion at this point.
Beth, thank you so much for that very well-organized and data-driven briefing. That's what we need to hear these days. Let me kick off the Q&A portion here. Again, I'd like to invite everyone in our audience to submit your questions now on the right side of your screen, and we'll get to as many as possible. Let's start off, Beth, talking just about other solutions, things like tying loans to income or accountability for universities. Talk to us about some of those things that you're thinking about.
Yeah, so there's one innovation that we've seen in the past 5 years that I'm actually really excited about in higher ed finance. So, when I kind of dismiss this idea that there's a student loan crisis, it's kind of me, saying that there's not an issue. There's no issue here. But in fact, that's not what I believe. I just think that the issue is different than the one that people have largely identified. And what I believe to be the problem for us to solve with higher ed finance is risk. If someone told you, you could go to college, pay $50,000 a year, and you'd be guaranteed a $5 million return over the course of your lifetime, I'd sign up in an instant, right? There's no concern. There's nothing to be worried about. And so the current system doesn't do a great job of basically taking that notion into account. But there's a new financial instrument being used called an income share agreement that actually very explicitly addresses that concern. So similar to the income-based repayment program for the federal student loan pool, what it does is it sets a contract between a borrower and a financier, which for the most part so far have been colleges and universities themselves. And what the contract says is that the student will pay back a fraction of their income for a set period of time in lieu of paying tuition. So the way this works is that I study for free, and I basically am passing back a portion of the earnings that I'll get after I graduate to compensate the college or university for the education I've received. So it's a model that we've seen discussed in theory for a very long time. Milton Friedman wrote about it in the 1950s, but it hasn't operated in practice until very recently. In the past 5 years, we've actually seen it comes from being just a theoretical construct to now Purdue University created the first income share agreement program about 5 years ago that really kicked off the industry. And now there's dozens of colleges and universities across the country that are using ISAs as a supplement to federal student loans, or as an alternative to loans entirely in instances when different types of programs don't actually have access to the subsidized loans through the federal lending program.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Here we have a question in from Pat at our University of Pittsburgh chapter. Is the cost of getting a college degree rising faster than the ROI? Or in other words, is the lifetime profit margin from getting a higher education degree, is that going to track with the projected increased price of a degree in the future?
Yeah, right on. That's a great question. And actually, it's a note I had on my list here that I failed to mention. So when I talk about things that I am concerned about, it is in fact tuition inflation. So all of our studies that estimate ROI, as you might be imagining, are backward looking. So if I wanted to know how much your degree is worth, the one that you're going to finish this year, next year, or maybe a couple of years ago, I'd need a crystal ball in order to know what your wages are going to be over the course of your lifetime, and then compare it to something that I think you would have earned if you hadn't gone to graduate school. So we can't do that exercise. So instead, what economists do is use these backward-looking studies where we look at what people with college degrees earned relative to those who didn't over history. And since we want to look at the entirety of their career, we end up looking pretty far back in the data to do that. So there is some question about the validity of that data, and a particular question that I have, and it sounds like some of our viewers have as well, is that as the tuition continues to rise, it is going to necessarily eat into the potential returns unless we were to also see a simultaneous increase in the wage premium paid to college-educated workers. So I'm skeptical that we will be able to keep pace with the tuition inflation that we've seen, such that the return will remain constant. And so I do imagine that decreasing over time if the tuition inflation trend continues. And that's something that I'm particularly concerned about. And I keep hoping that as we have more information in the marketplace for education, that we can start to see consumers be policing institutions a bit more about the price and the value that they provide. You know, historically, we saw colleges and universities being able to increase prices year after year after year in a way, even potentially just to signal how elite they were, which is a problem in a marketplace where the quality of the service being provided is actually difficult for the customer to assess. Sometimes we fall back on looking at the price to know which is a quality product or service. And I think that's happened here a bit. But I will say, when I shopped for college, for instance, I looked at that telephone book style U.S. News and World Reports catalog, which ranked all of the colleges. And so, I had to kind of just say, okay, this college is 30,000, this one's 27,000. And I had no real sense of if they were worth that price tag. Students today have the advantage of being able to log into a federal website called thecollegescorecard.com, look up any colleges that they're considering going to, and seeing exactly how much recent graduates from that college are earning. And so in theory, we're empowering people to go and say, so you're charging me $50,000 in tuition, but your grads are only making 15% more than the average high school graduate. And that should, in the long run, at least if you believe in markets, push down on the prices or hold institutions accountable for providing opportunities after graduation that justify their price tag. So I'm the eternal optimist, hoping that that will have an impact on tuition inflation in the long run, but only time will tell.
Well, we here at the Adam Smith Society are believers in the markets. And it sounds like you're talking about introducing some competition and price transparency and value transparency into the marketplace. And while we're on this topic of ROI and rising tuition costs, what do you think are the main drivers of the rising price tag of higher education?
If I knew the answer to that question, I'd have a lot of great opportunities in front of me. I don't know. I think I tend to think that, the lack of access to information on value has allowed institutions to continue to increase price tag year after year. Another common theory, of course, is that as we continue to subsidize higher education to a greater extent, institutions will be able to extract the value of those subsidies. In theory, Economics 101 tells us, how does the price change when we introduce a subsidy? For higher education, the strict subsidies are Pell Grants. So, you get a couple $1,000s based on your family's income towards paying for college. So in theory, that should shift up the price. Your willingness to pay increases by the amount that you get that Pell Grant. The entire demand curve shifts, and that translates into an increase in price. Something that I'm concerned about, though, is that as we've increased access to debt, which in theory should not have the same effect, because these are really your own dollars that you're using when you're paying for education. I'm concerned that people don't appreciate when they're using debt versus when they're using grants. And I don't mean to say that to be insulting of anyone's intelligence as they go through this process, but research has shown that institutions actually do a pretty decent job of being really opaque about the financial aid awards that students are getting. So they may not even know how much they're spending. And that's consistent with the survey research that I did that said that students don't realize how much debt they had even just shortly after signing their first promissory note. So to me, that means there may be some sort of similar type effect that as we've increased the ability for people to borrow to pay for college, that colleges are increasing their prices in accordance with that.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here, a couple questions on this topic. One member, Clifford, asks, and again, we have a couple of similar questions here, so I'll try to bring them together. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about higher education alternatives. So more career-centric type technical schools. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your thinking there in terms of, is that a good alternative for people? What are your thoughts on those alternatives to higher education?
Yeah, so I'm actually really excited about a lot of the alternatives that have popped up, especially in recent years. One of the areas that has been really frequently discussed, especially in mainstream media, is the boot camp model, the boot camp style education. And those are largely used to put people on a fast track into computer coding and programming type careers. They tend to be pretty inexpensive, pretty quick, and end up giving people access to relatively high earnings. So there's a good ROI. What's interesting is that there's definitely a hesitance, I think, in our culture of utilizing these alternative forms of education. They seem to have some sort of stigma. And I'll say I had an interesting meeting with a reporter from the New York Times one day who said to me, "Come on, aren't those boot camps just a scam?" And I thought that was a really great indication of actually the way that people see these, because I think there is a sense that bachelor's and associate's degrees are the gold standard. They've become, in a sense, part of the American dream now. But from a purely practical standpoint, who decided that 2 years or 4 years are the exact right number of years of education to prepare every person for the type of job that they're looking for? And so, I am optimistic that we can eliminate over time the stigma of more career-oriented education, so that when people consider education after high school, they can have a wider breadth of opportunities that they'll be able to consider. Because it's certainly the case that there there are pathways outside of traditional academic tracks that are paying huge dividends for students.
Yes, whenever I need to call a plumber, I'm usually well aware of that.
Yeah.
So another question here from Brad regarding some of the solutions you talked about, namely the income share agreements. For those students that might not be able to receive something like that because their majors don't provide a historically high ROI, there are other ways to think about that or other alternatives for that for students who might need something else.
Yeah, so that was actually a common concern or criticism of income share agreements when they started to be put into practice. But what they found was that the companies who are able to finance income share agreements are able to finance them for any major and for any, historical ROI. So what happens is that if I'm in a high earnings major like engineering, I just get a better quote unquote price than somebody who's in a lower wage occupation. For instance, teachers, unfortunately, have a relatively low wage, or people who study education have a relatively low wage, but they also have a relatively certain wage. So somebody who's financing an income share agreement has a pretty good sense of exactly what that person is going to earn. And so they can just price it differently. So that's a solvable problem. What are some other solutions? As I said, this is on the theme of risk, and how do you make higher education less financially risky so that it can actually really work well as a pathway for social mobility in our economy? Some of the other solutions that we're seeing are college insurance, which is a kind of an interesting idea. So there is a company now where, if I were sending my son to college this year, he's 2, so he's not quite ready, but if he were going, I could send him, off to the University of Utah here, where we live, and buy him an insurance policy, if I wanted, that said, if he's earning less than $40,000 a year after he graduates, then this company will pay him the difference between his salary and $40,000 a year, or whatever terms they may be. And in exchange for that, I'll pay a premium on the front end before we know how much he's going to earn that entitles him to that privilege. So I think that's going to be a growing and interesting model. That's a solution that's coming from the private sector. And that's kind of like the vanilla version of it. And some colleges are already doing more complex versions of that are kind of hidden in other programs and things. But I'm optimistic that we'll see more of that in the future. And some of them are actually using similar financial instruments to create something that looks like a money-back guarantee, which is also, I think, a really interesting idea. We're used to seeing money-back guarantees or warranties for other high-end or high-cost products or services like, durable consumer items like washing machines or cars. And that's because those are investments and that people are expecting them to pay off over the course of time. And if they don't, it's actually a huge financial impact on those individuals. And so college has the same characteristics in that sense, and that you're expecting it to have a durability that in creating value for you over a long period of time. And if it doesn't, you're sort of in trouble. So ensuring that through different means, whether it be a warranty or a guarantee or more traditional insurance product, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. And along these lines of alternatives, whether it be financing higher education or a non-traditional educational track versus a typical liberal arts college, what do you make of the for-profit colleges? Sher, that's another thing that we read a lot about. So please just tell us, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, sure. So if you had asked me this question, like I think 5 years ago, I would have said, well, there's no reason why, the tax status of a college necessarily means that it can or cannot create value for students, right? We interact with lots of companies that are for-profit companies that create value for us. For instance, Apple, I happen to love their products, and they're a for-profit company, but I don't hate them. And in fact, I think that the service they provide is well worth what it is that I have to pay for their products. And so I thought, why can't that be the case in higher education as well? It turns out that I sort of had to eat my words on that a little bit, because a study came out that showed that the for-profit colleges that did emerge in the 1990s, when there was a big explosion of them, actually did a really poor job in serving their students. So while I still believe in theory that for-profit colleges could provide a valuable service, what we found in practice is that they haven't. And at the same time, they've tended to serve students who were more financially disadvantaged. They recruited students through things like appealing to people who are using GI benefits, or accommodating people who were working full time and offering evening courses. So these are non-traditional, not the relatively privileged 18-year-old going off after high school. So these are people who were really hoping to get a financial return, or even needing to get a financial return, and they didn't. What we see is that their repayment rates on their student loans are actually much, much worse than similar people at nonprofit or public colleges. And so that's really concerning. I think that we need to start holding all of our colleges accountable to a different degree. We assess the value of our colleges for the purpose of determining their eligibility for federal dollars by looking at their teaching model, their curriculum, what their faculty look like. And unfortunately, those things don't always correlate with the outcomes that we need students to get. And so I'm really an advocate for pushing towards an outcomes-based accountability system that would hold for-profit and nonprofit and public colleges to the same standards. And those standards need to be based around employment, earnings, and ability to repay debt. That would be a big pivot from where we are today, and it would be a big culture shift, because we've been in a position of largely believing higher ed institutions to be benevolent, at least those that are nonprofit or public. But I think that's a direction I'd love to see policy go in, and I think it would allow for reemergence or reinventing of a for-profit college sector that could actually contribute in a positive way.
And of course, we're coming up on election season, just a few months away. Education is always a topic. You mentioned things like student loan forgiveness, other policy proposals such as free college have been mentioned. Can you talk about your thoughts on what does free college mean, and what does student loan forgiveness mean? Can you share some thoughts along those lines for us?
Yeah, so we talked a bit about student loan forgiveness. Kind of in sum, it's just that my concern with it is that it's largely regressive. We already have progressive student loan forgiveness, and that's giving forgiveness away to people who actually find their loans to be unaffordable. That seems like a pretty smart way to do it. So I'd like to stick with that rather than going with one of these more populist kind of good sounding plans that just wipe away everyone's student debt. What we've seen recently is that Biden who we presume will be the nominee for the Democratic Party, had previously not endorsed a free college plan, but it recently has gone ahead and done that. So I think we will see a debate heating up over free college again. Again, I tend not to be a huge fan of these models, because I think that they deliver the benefit and support to less needy individuals. So right now, if I were to want to go to community college coming from a low income family, I would very likely be going for free already, because of the existence of state and federal grants, and that the subsidies through states make community colleges and even public colleges very low cost institutions to attend. So by making those programs free in terms of their enrollment cost, we'd simply be extending that benefit to people farther up in the income distribution. The argument for free college, just to not be too dismissive of that, is that, if we want to rely on higher education to serve as an important mechanism for social mobility in our economy, which I think we do, one concern is that there seems to be a barrier that lower income people don't seem to know when college will be affordable to them. We have a lot of opacity in the way that college pricing is done. And so even though our lowest income students are already going to college for free, but very often, to the extent there's an information barrier that stands in the way of them knowing that, it doesn't really matter. And we're not succeeding in getting them in and through. So making college free could solve that problem, and that everybody would just know that college was a possibility for them. And I think there's something to that. I just also happen to believe that the fiscal costs and the trade-offs that are involved with going that road are not worthwhile, that we'd be much better off to spend those resources otherwise, and actually just work harder on trying to get people to have an awareness of what benefits are available to them in the current system.
Thank you, Beth. And we've got one final question here. This is from Luke from our Notre Dame chapter, very much along these lines. He asks, and these are his words, not mine, Beth, you mentioned young professionals that are often surprised about their initial student loan payment. What is available for incoming undergraduate students, or even graduate students perhaps, to become more informed about debt, especially if they are coming from and this is Luke's word, a less than free market high school environment?
This is actually a place where you do have to do a lot of your own homework, and we don't make it that easy for people to know, when they're borrowing, what it's going to mean for their future budgets. Some colleges are actually creating more tools that people can use to say, okay, I've borrowed $3,000 this year. That's going to be a $150 payment per month over 10 years after I graduate. But any financial aid officer in the country would be thrilled to sit down with their students and talk through what the implications of that student's borrowing and future borrowing will be on their budget. So I'd say that's a resource that's untapped. Anybody who has access to federal student aid dollars also has access to a financial aid officer in their financial aid office. So I think that's the way to go. Get friendly with those folks and let them help you with the math and make sure you know where you're headed.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Beth, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and this very, very important conversation. We touched on a lot of things, some very practical things, just like we concluded with here, and some big picture policy issues. I'd like to invite everyone on the conference today to join us for our next Eventcast, which will be on June 25th, 1 p.m. Eastern again, for a discussion with Harvard University economist Ed Glazer for a conversation about the way forward for America's cities. In the meantime, I wish everyone health and well-being. Beth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.